Hey, shalom, shalom, shalom lakam, which is peace unto you all. Hayawam tawab la atham, za achyakam yawam on Chagadol Charlotte, which is good day. This is your brother Yawam from the GMS camp in Charlotte. Nachamatam kaya, hamala katha shamayim kwara, repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Call halayim la la abanawa Yahweh, bahasham Yahweh Shai, bahasham Racha HaKodash, wa mashanala zakoinawa, wa malakim shor Chagadol, which is all praises to our Father Yahweh, which means he exists, bahasham, in the name Yahweh Shai, he delivers in double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. Zayah Shaya, this is Isaiah chapter 45, and we'll get verse 6. And it says that I'm gonna start at verse 5. It says, I am the Lord, Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai, and there is none else. There is no power beside me. I girded thee, though thou hast not known me, that they may know from the rising of the sun and from the west that there is none beside me. I am the Lord, and there is none else. So everything that is ultimately wrought, throughout creation, all right, is by the hand of the Lord, Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai. So it says verse 7, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. All right, and the Lord ultimately is all powerful. He has the right hand and he has the left hand. It's perfect balance. Let me get a quick precept or two precepts real fast. This is Bon Sirach chapter 33, and we'll get verse 13. And it says 13. It says, as the clay is in the potter's hand to fashion it at his pleasure, so man is in the hand of him that made him to render to them as liketh him best. All right, because ultimately we abide by the Lord's will. Nobody ultimately, can desire a role and, play a role that was not already given unto them. All right, everybody pretty much is playing out their role in this movie. That's why it goes into the script, because script goes back to the scriptures. All right, everything that pretty much is playing out is in the scriptures. All right, and it's ultimately the Lord's plan. So it says, verse 14, good is set against evil and life against death. So is the godly against the sinner and the sinner against the godly. So look upon all the works of the Most High, and there are two and two, one against another. So that's perfect balance, because a false balance ultimately is an abomination, and the Lord is a just power. All right, so let's get another one. Let's get Mashal Proverbs chapter 16, and we'll get verse 11. And it says, a just weight and balance are the Lord's. All the weights of the bag are his work. Again, going into, the fact that the Lord is a just power. All right, when we look at all the foundations and the rudiments of how creation was pretty much made up, it was made in balance. All right, it's just that Esau, Edom ultimately has thrown off that balance. All right, but going down to verse 7, it says, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. All right, and ultimately, in the ancient world, this was common knowledge. All right, present day, Esau, due to the rulership of Esau, Edom, he has skewed the minds of the people. All right, but really, when we look at judgment, all right, and when we look at it in the grand scheme of things, ultimately, it's the hand of the Lord that is ultimately in control of everything. From the judgments, to judgments that's handed out. All right, things that take place, things that take place on a day-to-day. All right, it's by the hand of the Lord. All right. So reading it again, it says, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. All right. So when, someone takes their last breath, ultimately it was sanctioned by the Lord, Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai. All right. So I'm going to get a couple more precepts. Let's get Deuteronomy chapter 32. And let me see. Deuteronomy 32 and verse 39. All right. And it says, see now that I, even I, am he, and there is no power with me. All right, we pretty much got the same thing in Isaiah, the 45th chapter. All right, there's no other power, all right, that ultimately is in charge of judgment. All right, it says, see now that I, even I, am he, and there is no power with me. All right, and if there is any so-called power, all right, ultimately it is ascribed to the left hand, in which those are idols. All right, but the things that pretty much people believe in this world, all right, of the world, ultimately they're just ascribed to the left hand of the Lord, and the right hand ultimately goes into the scriptures, all right, the truth, all right, which the right hand of the Lord is Yahweh Shai. All right, but pretty much it shows that the Lord Yahweh, is all powerful, all knowing, and omnipotent. But verse 39 again, it says, "See now that even I am He, and there is no power with me. I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal. Neither is there any that can deliver out of my hand." In which, when we go into Hebrew, you got the Ha Alap Bayat, the alphabet. Ha is the, Alap is that goes into what's known in the alphabet as alpha, because really alphabet derives from Alap Bayat. All right, but the alpha part will be Alap, because alpha really means number one. Alap is number one. All right, or it corresponds with the number one. Bayat is the house. All right, in which the bet part in alphabet really goes into Bayat, which means a house. So those are the first two letters of the alphabet. All right, which really again it derives from Alap Bayat. But reading up to the number 10 in Hebrew is Abba Gada Hawaza Chataya. That's 10. All right, in which when you look at both of your hands, all right, you got 10 fingers. All right, so you create with your hands. All right, so reading the scripture right here, it says, "See now that even I am He, and there's no power with me. I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal. Neither is there any that can deliver out of my hand." Because the Lord is the creator. All right, he's all powerful. All right, when we look at that, the Hebrew character Yah, all right, that ultimately be the Lord Yahweh, because he's the ultimate power. All right, again, when you got the 10 fingers on the hand, all right, the Yah in Hebrew is representative of the hand. All right, so the ultimate hand is the Most High Yahweh. He's the most powerful. He's the Most High. All right, so let's get this as well. This is let me see. We'll get Job chapter 12 and we'll get verse 10. I'll start at verse 7. It says, "But ask now the beasts, and they shall teach thee, and the fowls of the air, and they shall tell thee." All right, when you look at creation, all right, when you look at the animals, ants, spiders, which Jake is a little squeamish, different little creatures, but they all got a purpose. But reading it again, it says, "But ask now the beasts, and they shall teach thee, and the fowls of the air, and they shall tell thee." All right, in which when you look at the animals, all right, they're all in order. All right, and they all follow the which is kind of messed up a little bit now, you see, but everything pretty much in creation is it follows its specific order. All right, in which even though it's still the planet Earth is thrown out of course, everything is pretty much crying out, you see, and it still has some of its natural created. It still has its creative spirit. All right, and what I mean by that is, all right, trees. All right, the trees are in a morning state, you see, but they still have some of their spirit that they initially was created to do, which again is morning, but ultimately it still, it still does some of its function. All right, and so on and so forth with each of the other creations. But reading it again, it says, "But ask now the beasts, and they shall teach thee, and the fowls of the air, and they shall tell thee, or speak to the earth, and it shall teach thee, and the fishes of the sea shall declare unto thee." Because ultimately, if these things, which is personifying, the creations, the beasts and stuff like that, you see. But if we actually could talk to, if we had the ability currently to talk, to creation, all right, it ultimately would it would say it's in a morning state, you see. But then also, creation understands, the order that which the Lord Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai set up. All right, and that's why essentially it understands in its spirit, our creation, that it's in a morning state, and ultimately the earth, needs a true resetting. But continuing on, it says, "Who knoweth not in all these, who knoweth not in all these that the hand of the Lord Yahweh hath wrought these, or hath wrought this." All right, let's get this in the NLT. And it says, "For they all know that my disaster," well, CSB, it says, "Which of all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this?" So everything in the planet Earth is by the hand of the Lord Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai. All right. Continuing on in verse 10, it says, "In whose hand is the soul of every living thing, and the breath of all mankind." All right. And which it's like the Lord has a big chessboard. All right. And, with his hand, he's moving the different pieces. All right. And everything is being moved according to his will. It says every living thing and the breath of all mankind, because ultimately, when we look at oxygen, when it's likened unto the Hebrew alphabet, all right, will be representative of the Yah character. All right. Because the Lord Yahweh, is responsible, for, again, the soul of every living thing, all right, and the breath of all mankind. When you look at breath, again, it's oxygen, it's a gas, and what you do with a gas is ultimately you fuel things, so a hand ultimately is representative of creating, but then also energy, so ultimately the Lord is responsible, for the energy that that sustains every creature. All right, and that's why it goes back to the example I brought out through the spirit. When we see like people that's on like hospice and stuff like that, you know, hospice, and they're receiving like the assisted breathing thing, when they take their last breath, where the Lord sanctioned that. All right, because the Lord ultimately again is responsible for the breath of all mankind. Let's get another precept. This is Ayawab, Job chapter 34, we get verse 3, or let me see, verse 14. It says, if he set his heart upon man, if he gather unto himself his spirit and his breath, you know. Again, every breath is sanctioned by the Lord. When someone passes, ultimately, I'm gonna keep going. Verse 15, it says, all flesh shall perish together, and man shall turn again unto dust. So when the Lord collects a spirit, or just how it says in Ecclesiastes the 12th chapter, or ultimately the spirit goes back to the Lord, you see. But then when that person takes their last breath, again, it's sanctioned by the Lord, Yahweh Bahasham, Yahweh Shai. All right, so Ayawab, Job chapter 27 and verse 3, and it says, all the while, I'm gonna start at verse 1. It says, moreover, Job continued his parable and said, as the Most High liveth, who hath taken away my judgment, and the Almighty who hath vexed my soul. All the while my breath is in me, and the spirit of the Most High is in my nostrils, because ultimately that air that we breathe in is representative of the spirit of the Lord Yahweh. All right. So I'm going to get one more and that'll be it. But this is Acts chapter 17, and we'll get verse 25. 20. We'll start at verse 22. It says, then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious. For as I passed by and behold your devotions, I found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown power, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you. In which Jake was ultimately scattered. Jake was scattered, so Jake was going off, but Jake got that zeal, you see, but not according to knowledge. But it says, whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you. It says, the Most High that made the world and all things therein, because the Lord creates things with his hands. All right. In which, the Lord Yahweh, dispatched, the Alahayim, all right, in which in turn created everything. All right. But the blueprint came from the Lord Yahweh. It says the Most High that made the world, the powers that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is the Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands. All right, because we ultimately had there was the first and the second temple, all right, which they had their purposes, and the third temple is spiritual, you see. But those ultimately was a foreshadowing of how Jake was to subscribe and to seek true sustainment and power and establishment in the Lord Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai. But it wasn't about, all right, a physical place. All right, so it says, reading it again, it says, the powers that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is the Lord of heaven and earth, all right, in which the hierarchy is the Most High Yahweh, the Lord Yahweh Shai, all right, and then on down to the rest of the elect. But it says, seeing that he is the Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worship with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to life, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things. All right, the Lord gives, life and breath. All right. We got Deuteronomy 32 and 39, and we got Isaiah 45 and the seventh verse. It says, in all things, it says, and hath made of one blood all nations of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and hath determined the times before appointed and the bounds of their habitation. So every specific nation had a time to rule. All right, and Esau, Edom is in his specific time to where he's ultimately destroying everything. All right, but it's going to be reset. You see, because the whole creation is ultimately crying out. So it says, verse 27. It says that they should seek the Lord, if happily they might feel after him, and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said. For we are also his offspring. I right, but pretty much the point, again, going back to the example that I brought out in the spirit was, it says for in him we live and move. All right, because ultimately, again, everybody's abiding by the everybody's abiding by the plan of the Lord. All right, the will of the Lord. All right, the Lord ultimately is moving everyone as chess pieces. All right, but really the points I wanted to get was verse 25, where it says, and breath. The Lord gives breath, life. All right, and also, we ultimately are able to move about and traverse and do whatever we do. By the hand of the Lord, Yahweh Bahasham, Yahweh Shai. The Lord ultimately isn't pretty much in control. He's all powerful, and that's why he's known as to have omnipotence. You see, so just wanted to go into that. Adawan Tazaz about Nayapa. Lord's will, that was a beautiful edification to the spirit. Wadawan Tazah. Atam Yashka Wam Tawab. Lord's will, you have a good day. Washalam Lakam.